Britain just built a locked door inside its own house of worship and handed the key to the Home Office. On March 6, 2024, the government unveiled a new official definition of extremism, widening the net beyond violence to ideology itself. Within weeks, groups once treated as community partners faced review, funding freezes, and platform bans. So where does faith end and politics begin? To understand why this landed like an earthquake, you have to understand the house Britain built decades earlier. Through the 1980s and 90s, both Labour and Conservative governments embraced a settlement that left religious communities largely alone to run their own affairs. Faith schools multiplied, Sharia councils handled family disputes informally, and local councils treated mosque committees and imams as the natural go-betweens for entire neighborhoods. By 2017, there were roughly 85 Sharia councils operating across England, handling an estimated 100,000 cases since the 1980s, almost entirely outside statutory oversight. The number of state-funded faith schools climbed past 6,800 by the early 2000s, nearly a third of all state schools in England. Nobody in Westminster wanted a French-style fight over secularism, the kind that produced France's 2004 ban on religious symbols in schools. The bargain? Keep your floor, keep your keys, and the state stays out of the stairwell. That bargain rested on an unexamined assumption, that being religiously conservative and being politically dangerous were two different things. The PREVENT strategy, launched in 2003 and expanded in 2011 under Theresa May as Home Secretary, was built to catch the second without disturbing the first. PREVENT's budget grew from roughly £6 million in its earliest years to over £40 million annually by the 2010s, funneled through local authorities and schools. The Muslim Council of Britain, founded in 1997 and eventually representing over 500 affiliated mosques and organizations, became the government's default phone number for the entire Muslim population, one organization standing in for millions of individual beliefs. Then the floor cracked. The 2005 London bombings on July 7th killed 52 people and injured over 770, carried out by 4 British-born men, and showed radicalisation could happen inside communities the state had never really looked into. The 2014 Jay report on Rotherham, authored by Professor Alexis Jay, found that at least 1,400 children had been sexually exploited in the town between 1997 and 2013, and documented how council staff avoided intervening for fear of appearing racist toward the mostly Pakistani heritage perpetrators. The hands-off consensus stopped looking like tolerance and started looking like avoidance. Avoidance became untenable after October 2023. Weekly marches over Gaza filled central London starting that month, some pulling more than 100,000 people according to Metropolitan Police estimates, with organizers like the Palestine Solidarity Campaign coordinating turnout nearly every Saturday for months. Police made over 600 arrests linked to the protests between October 2023 and March 2024, mostly for public order offenses. Ministers suddenly had to ask a question they'd dodged for years. Who exactly is organizing this, and toward what? Home Secretary Suella Braverman called them hate marches that November, a phrase that detonated across British politics and contributed to her dismissal from the Home Office days later, on November 13, 2023, after also writing an unauthorized op-ed accusing police of bias. Counter-terror police reported referrals for extremist material climbing sharply through 2023 and into 2024, with the Metropolitan Police citing a 25% rise in hate crime reports in the weeks following October 7th. The open apartment building suddenly had strangers in the stairwell, and nobody could agree whether they were guests or threats. Michael Gove decided the argument needed a new rulebook, not just new opinions. As community secretary, he announced on March 6, 2024, the first change to the government's working definition of extremism since the 2011 PREVENT framework. Gove told the House of Commons the new definition would apply to at least 6 groups initially under scrutiny, though he declined at the time to name them publicly, citing ongoing assessments. The new definition doesn't wait for violence. It targets the promotion of ideologies that undermine fundamental rights, democracy, or the rule of law, a much wider net than British policy had ever cast, and deliberately so. That wider net immediately caught organizations that had spent years inside the tent. The Home Office launched a review of groups including MEND, Muslim Engagement and Development, founded 2014, and CAGE, founded 2003, known for advocacy on behalf of Guantanamo Bay detainees, including Moazzam Beg, assessing whether their activities crossed into the newly drawn territory. MEND had previously received funding and platforms from over a dozen local councils and police forces for anti-hate crime training before the review began. The Muslim Council of Britain was never formally banned. Ministers had already frozen it out informally since 2009, after the deputy leader of an affiliate group signed the Istanbul Declaration, which the government read as endorsing violence against foreign naval forces. But the new engagement principles, published alongside Gove's announcement, made that distance official policy, barring civil servants from partnering with any group meeting the extremism definition. The landlord hadn't evicted anyone yet. He'd just changed the locks and started deciding who gets a new key. Supporters describe this as 20 years late, not 20 years too soon. The Commission for Countering Extremism, set up in 2017 under Commissioner Sarah Khan, had repeatedly flagged a blind spot around non-violent extremism. Ideology that never crosses into a bombing but still corrodes trust in democratic institutions. Khan's 2021 report specifically warned that existing law left a lawful but harmful gap ministers had never closed. William Shawcross's 2023 review of Prevent, commissioned in 2021 and delayed for over a year amid controversy about his own past writings, argued the strategy had drifted too far toward the far right and away from Islamist ideology specifically, finding that 80% of Prevent referrals concerning Islamism between certain years were incorrectly filtered compared to far-right cases. Then came the number that gave the policy its political cover. The Community Security Trust recorded 4,103 anti-Semitic incidents in 2023, the highest figure ever logged in Britain since records began in 1984, and more than double the 1,662 incidents recorded in 2022. For the government, that statistic was proof the old assumption had failed. Civil liberties groups heard something very different. Not a reckoning, but a landlord reserving the right to search any tenant's apartment without a warrant. Liberty and Amnesty International UK both filed formal objections within weeks of the March announcement, with Liberties director Akiko Hart warning in a public statement that the definition's language was so broad it could capture legitimate campaigning. Their fear wasn't about violent extremists, who were never protected in the first place. It was about mainstream Muslim advocacy groups getting swept into a definition broad enough to catch ordinary political dissent. The Muslim Council of Britain, led at the time by Secretary General Zahra Mohammed, called it outright what it feared it was: a McCarthyite designation aimed disproportionately at one community's institutions, and pointed to the reference to Joseph McCarthy's 1950s anti-communist hearings in America as the closest historical parallel they could find. The disagreement stopped being theoretical the moment universities and councils had to apply it. Universities UK, representing 141 member institutions, updated its guidance in 2024 to reflect the new definition, forcing student unions and administrators to make judgment calls about speakers and societies they'd never scrutinized before. At least a dozen local councils, including several in London and the West Midlands, spent the spring combing through grant recipients and partnership lists, quietly deciding who still qualified for a seat at the table. Birmingham City Council alone reviewed funding arrangements affecting more than 20 community organizations. Nobody was arrested. No organization was outlawed. The exclusion runs entirely through funding and access, which is precisely what makes it so hard to challenge and so easy to expand. That distinction is the whole story. For the first time, Britain's famously light-touch model has an official line separating belief from politics, and the state drew it, not the communities themselves. The line lives in policy, not statute, meaning a future government could redraw or erase it without a single vote in Parliament, since it was implemented through ministerial announcement rather than an act of Commons or Lords. Groups under review keep functioning exactly as before. They just lose the government platforms, funding streams, and ministerial handshakes that used to signal legitimacy. And the precedent doesn't stop at Islamist organizations. The same engagement principles were cited in mid-2024 when officials reviewed at least 2 far-right adjacent groups and 1 environmental network accused of undermining rule of law through direct action. Once a state builds a mechanism for deciding which ideologies undermine democracy, that mechanism doesn't ask what religion is at the door. The building's tenants are already testing the new locks. Several affected organizations, including MEND, have threatened legal challenges through 2024, arguing the definition is too vague to survive scrutiny, with lawyers citing Article 10 and Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights covering free expression and association. Parliament is still debating whether to codify the whole thing into law, which would make it far harder to reverse and far easier to enforce. The core question, where religious conservatism ends and political extremism begins, remains exactly as unresolved as the day Gove announced the change. Britain redraws Theleinon Fech and Puine, Wunron Fech and Puar. The old apartment building let every faith keep its own keys to its own floor, and for decades that was the whole of British tolerance. Now there's a landlord checking who's on which floor and why, and the tenants are still arguing whether that's safety or surveillance. Do you think Britain just closed a dangerous loophole or opened a door to policing belief itself? Tell me which one you're seeing in the comments, and subscribe if you want the next chapter of this story.